Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Lamed Vav Amud Beis 36b of Maseches Kiddushin, the top line of the page. The Gemara is dealing with the Mishnah from the previous page. The Mishnah had said that many of the actions, many of the components of bringing offerings, bringing karbanos, are only performed by men and not by women. So it talked about smicha, pushing down on the animal, and tenufos, and waving them, and other things. And finally it said hahazos, the sprinkling of the blood. There were different types of sprinkling, sometimes on the mizbeach, sometimes on the paroches, on the curtain. But all these sprinklings were, sometimes there's two different mizbeachs. All these sprinklings were, the Mishnah says, nohagim ba'anoshim v'lo b'nashim. They applied to and were conducted by men and not by women, except, it says, the waving of the karban mincha, of the meal offering of a sota, and of a nazira, a woman who becomes a Nazirite. There they would actually wave their own karbanos. So, our Gemara, top of the page, it says, Vehazos, it quotes the Mishnah that hazos, the sprinkling of blood, was performed by men and is performed by men and not by women. The Gemara says, Hazah dehecha. Which Hazah are we talking about, which sprinkling that it was necessary to teach me that it's for men and not women? What Hazah might I have thought could apply for women also? Id para, if it's talking about the sprinkling of the blood of the para aduma, the red heifer. After they would slaughter the red heifer, they would sprinkle the blood. So if that's what I might have thought a woman could do, says the Gemara, I would never have thought that Elazar kasubba. It says specifically there that it was Elazar HaKohen. Elazar the Kohen was at that point the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. So it's specifically the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, that does it. Not even a regular Kohen can do it. So I wouldn't think that a woman who's not a practicing Kohen could do it. If only the Kohen Gadol could do it. So it must not be coming to teach me that sprinkling is for men, not women, because it's not really for men even. It's only for the Kohen Gadol. Idapinim, if it's talking about the sprinklings that were done inside the Heichal, the Kodesh, the area of the Beis HaMikdash that contained all the holy vessels. So there were certain karbanos that involved, like I mentioned, sprinkling on the paroches, on the curtain that separates the Kodesh from the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the holy from the Holy of Holies, or in the Kodesh, in the holy section, there was the golden mizbeach that was for Ketorah. Sometimes you would sprinkle onto there. So those were for specific karbanos, but there it says HaKohen HaMashiach Kasava. Again, it says that it had to be the Kohen HaMashiach, the anointed Kohen. That's the Kohen Gadol. So a Kohen Gadol had to do it, not a regular Kohen even. So I would have no notion that it could be a woman. So why does the Mishnah have to tell me that hazos, that sprinklings, are only done by men, not by women? Ella, so rather, says the Gemara, hazah de ben of. It's talking about the sprinkling of a ben of a bird offering, a karban chatas, a sin offering, which could be brought from a bird. And actually I think sometimes women, after a woman would give birth, she could end up bringing a karban chatas. She would bring a karban chatas, a bird offering, so from a bird. So you might think that it's this type of offering that a woman is also allowed to sprinkle the blood. So, and it never excludes her from sprinkling the blood. So I would think that she's included in it. So that's why the Mishnah had to tell me that she's not. And how does the Mishnah know that a woman cannot do the sprinkling of the blood, even of the karban chatas, the sin offering of a bird? Da'asya b'kal v'chomer. It learns it out from a kal v'chomer, a fortiori. Logically, mi ben son, from a sheep offering. A sheep offering, Rashi tells us it's talking about a karban olah, an elevation offering. And there, says the Gemara, we can learn the following kal v'chomer. Uma ben son shelo kavalo kohen l'shritaso kavalo kohen lahaza also. If it's true for the sheep offering, the ola, the elevation offering of a sheep, that even though actually the shchita, the shechting of the sheep for the ola, can be done by anyone, even a hedyot. It's not specifically a kohen that has to do it. And yet, when it comes to the sprinkling, it says specifically, Vizarku b'nei Aaron, the sons of Aaron are the ones who do the sprinkling, which means only a kohen can do the sprinkling. So if it's true that by a karban ola of a sheep, anybody can do the shechting, but only a kohen can do the sprinkling. So, ben oaf, a bird offering, a karban chatas, shekavo lo kohen lemalikaso. A bird offering is slaughtered in a different way in the Beis Hamikdash for karbanos. For eating, we shechter also with a knife, the same type of slaughtering. But for the karbanos, the bird offering was shechting in a way, not really shchita, it's called malika, where you take the bird by the neck and you snap off its neck. That's how it was slaughtered. And that was specifically done by a kohen. That could not be done by a non-kohen. Because there it says, the krivo ha-kohen al mizbeach malakes rosho. The kohen brings it to the mizbeach and snaps off its head. So if it's true that when it comes to the bird, even at the slaughtering part, it has to be a kohen, eino din sheikvo lo kohen las also. Isn't it all the more so logically that it would have to be a kohen to do the sprinkling? If when it comes to an elevation offering of a sheep, an olah of a sheep, a zar, a non-kohen, could shecht it, but it has to be a kohen who does the sprinkling. So when it comes to the chatas, ha'of, a karban chatas, a sin offering of a bird, where a non-kohen cannot do the shechting. It has to be a kohen who does the malika. So all the more so at the next stage of the sprinkling, it should have to be a kohen who does the sprinkling. And that's how we know that it has to be done, it's only be done by a man, not by a woman. It's only men who are practicing as kohanim, and it's doing the actual service in the Beis Hamikdash. And that's how we know that a woman cannot do the hazah, the sprinkling of a karban. Now the Mishnah said, chutz mimincha soto nazir. The only area that we find that a woman does get involved in the avoda in the temple service is that she does the waving of her karban sota, of her karban mincha, if she is brought for it to be a sota, or if she is a nazira, she becomes a nazir, a nazira, and at the conclusion of her period, let's say 30 days, she brings a karban mincha, and she is involved in waving that karban. So, actually, sorry, it's not her karban mincha. I misspoke. It's not her karban mincha. It's, I believe, a karban chatas, and maybe another karban also. But whatever karban it is, she does the waving. Maybe we'll see as we go. I think. I'm not sure. Maybe it's a karban mincha. Whatever it is, there's a karban that a nazira brings, and she can do the actual waving of it. So the Gemara asks, Amar le Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshia didari. Rabbi Eliezer said to Rabbi Yoshia, who was in his generation. The Gemara is trying to tell you there was another Rabbi Yoshia who was not from his generation. He was speaking to the one from his generation, obviously. Lo tesev akarach ad amar tli lahashmaitza. Said Rabbi Eliezer to Rabbi Yoshia, don't sit down from your feet until you explain to me the following topic. Minayin lemincha sota shetuna tnufa. How do we know that the karban mincha of a sota, the meal offering of a sota, needs to be waved? That's what he asked. And how do we know it needs to be waved? Minalan. The Gemara says, from where? Begufa ksiv. It says it explicitly there. Ve'hei nifesa mincha. He should wave the mincha. In the context of the sota, it says that he should wave the mincha. So what's your question? Where do we know that you should wave the mincha of a sota? Ella rather Tnufa Bebaila Minalan. He was asking, how do we know that the carbon sota is waved by the person who's bringing it? In this case, the woman. So how do we know that? Because the pasuk that says Vehenif is actually, that it's waved, is actually talking about the Kohen. It says, and the Kohen will take from the hands of the woman the mincha, and he'll wave it. So how do we know that she waves it? It says that the Kohen waves it. So says the Gemara, Asya yad yad mishlamim. We learn a Gzeira Shava to compare two places that use the same word, which is by a carbon shlamim, a peace offering. Ksiv hacha, here, in the context of the sota, it says, V'lakacha kolei miyad ha'isha. And the Kohen will take from the hand of the woman. Uksiv hasam, and it says there, with regards to the carbon shlamim, Yadav tiviena. That's talking about the person bringing the carbon shlamim. It says his hands will bring it. Lehanifo, so it says in that verse, to wave it. So it says he'll bring it to wave it. The parts of the shlamim that get put on the mizbeach. So that get put on the altar. It's specific parts of that carbon, the chest and the imurim, I think, the fats. So, but he takes the parts of the shlamim that are going to be brought, and the one who's bringing it, the owner, the Yisrael, the Hediot, the non-Kohen, and he waves them. The owner waves them. So just like their Makan, so two things it says. Makan Kohen, just like by the sota, it says the word yad, it says the word hand, and it's the Kohen who waves it. So aflalon Kohen. So too by the shlamim, we learn yad yad, it's the Kohen who waves it. But it says that the owner waves it. And then we say the other way, mala halon bailim, just like by the carbon shlamim. Who waves it? It's the owners. Afkan bailim. So too by the sota, it's the owner, because it says yad yad to compare the two. So we're comparing the two. By the sota, it says that the Kohen waves it. So we learn from there that by the shlamim, the Kohen waves it. By the shlamim, it says that the owner waves it. So we learn from there that by the sota, the owner waves it. She waves it. So it says the Gemara, Haketza. How do you work this out? Who waves it? Says the Gemara, Kohen machnis yado tachas yad baim. The Kohen puts his hands under the hands of the owner, and they wave it together. That's how you get it waved at the same time. Both the carbon sota and the carbon shlamim, the owner holds it, and the Kohen puts his hands under, and they wave it together. Says the Gemara, Ashkechan sota. So we find, now we know how we know that the sota, that she waves it herself. That she's involved in the service. Nazira minal, and what about a Nazirite? How do we know that a Nazira, that she's also involved in waving her carbon? Says the Gemara, Asya kaf kaf misota. Another Gzeira Shava. Another two words that uses the same word in both places, and we learn to compare. And we're going to learn from sota to Nazira. Just like by a sota, she does the waving herself. She waves it. So too by a Nazira, she waves it. We learn it from kaf kaf, because it says by sota, Vinasana kapeha, he'll place it on her hands. He puts the carbon mincha in her hands. And by the Nazir, it also says Vinasana al kapeha Nazir, that he'll place the carbon on the hands of the Nazir. So therefore, we learn they're both being placed on their hands, just like the sota waves it, so too the Nazira waves her carbon as well. Okay, next Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Kol mitzvah shi teluya ba'aretz, eina noheges ela ba'aretz. Any mitzvah that's dependent on land, it's an agricultural mitzvah, is only practiced on a Torah level in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. V'she'ena teluya ba'aretz. And if it's not dependent on land, on agriculture, Now, Hagez bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. It applies both in Eretz Yisrael and outside of the land of Israel. Chutz, with the exception of min ha'arla v'kilayim. The exception of two agricultural mitzvahs which apply midoraisa by Torah law even outside of Israel, and that is arla, the idea that when you plant a fruit tree, the fruits are forbidden for the first 3 years. So that applies outside of Israel as well. Now the laws might be slightly different than they are in Eretz Israel, but still it applies midoraisa. V'kilayim, and the prohibition of kilayim. Kilayim is crossbreeding. So if you plant your grapes too close to your wheat, so that is it's close enough that they can crossbreed, so that is a transgression of kilayim. Lo sizra karmacha kilayim. Don't plant your vineyard kilayim, that will mix with the wheat field. Rabbi Eliezer says, Af hachadash. There's one other agricultural mitzvah which applies outside of Israel, according to Rabbi Eliezer, and that even on a Torah level, according to him, and that is chadash, the new grain, that the Torah prohibits, certainly in Israel, that we're not allowed to consume the new crop until we bring the Karban Omer on the second day of Pesach. That's the idea of Yashan and Chadash. So the Mishnah, the Tanna Kama, held that it doesn't apply outside of Israel on a Torah level, and Rabbi Eliezer is saying that it does apply outside of Israel. Even on a Torah level, you can't use grain that's grown until you bring the Karban Omer, until the second day of Pesach. So the Mishnah had said that mitzvos, commandments that are dependent on the land, apply only in Israel, in general, most, and if they are not dependent on land, then they apply even outside of Israel. Now, I explained already that means agricultural mitzvos, but the Gemara is first going to examine that. My tuluya umay she'ena tuluya. What does it mean it's dependent on the land, it's not dependent on the land? What is that? Ilema tuluya, maybe you'll say that tuluya, dependent on the land, means d'chsibba, it's the things that it says about it, bia, coming to the land. Because the Torah often says, ki savo al art, when you come to the land. So maybe you'll say that whenever it says in the Torah that when you come to the land you'll have this or that mitzvah, those mitzvahs only apply in the land, which would be very logical. And if it doesn't say ki savo al art when you come to the land, then it applies even outside of the land. Maybe that's what the Mishnah means. Not like I said when I explained it, that it has to do with if it's an agricultural mitzvah or not an agricultural mitzvah. Tuluya ba'aretz, dependent on the land, means if the Torah says v'haya ki savo al art, so it'll be when you come to the land you have this mitzvah, so then it applies only in Israel. And if it doesn't say that, then it applies outside of Eretz Yisrael. That's the Gemara's suggestion. If it's not dependent, that means it doesn't say bia, doesn't say when you come. Ask the Gemara, tefillin. But what about tefillin? Upeter chamor, and the redemption of the firstborn donkey. D'chsiba and bia. There it says when you come to the land. V'nohagim bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. And they apply both in the land and outside the land. Now the Gemara doesn't prove it from a verse, but the Gemara takes for granted that tefillin, even though it says it will be when you come to the land, that it applies equally outside of Israel. And the same for redeeming a firstborn donkey for a sheep, which is brought as a carbon. But the Gemara doesn't say how it knows. How does it know that these apply outside of Israel? It just says it can't be that it's dependent, that anything that says Vayaki Savo when you come to the land only applies in Israel, because we see, even though it says that with regards to tefillin and with regards to redeeming a donkey, still those apply outside of Israel. Rashi suggests that how does the Gemara know that tefillin applies outside of Israel? Because you find all over Shas, all over the Talmud, that the Amoraim in Bavel were wearing tefillin. So you see that it applies even outside of Israel. And redeeming the firstborn donkey, the Torah speaks about not really about it being in the land of Israel, but it's more so about whichever is the first one out of the womb. So that's what it's dependent on. It doesn't really matter where it is. Fine. So it can't be that that's what it means tluya ba'aretz, it's dependent on the land, because even when it can't be that means that wherever it says hayaki savo, when you come to the land, that's where those only apply in Israel, because we see that there are mitzvos that it says that apply even outside of Israel. So Amar Rav Yehuda, so Rav Yehuda says, Hachi Kamar, this is what the Mishnah is saying. Kol mitzvah she'ichovas haguf, any mitzvah that is an obligation on the body, on the person, no heges bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. If it's not dependent on land, meaning it's a person does it. So then it applies both in the land of Israel and outside. Chovas karka, but if it is an obligation on the land, that's what I meant before, as agricultural, it's related to the land itself. Eina no heges ela ba'aretz. Those only apply in the land of Israel. On a Torah level. Minaha nimili. From where do we know this? What's the source for this? Titana Rabban. The rabbis taught. The following brisa. We have a pasuk that says, the pasuk says, I'll just tell you outside, Ela hachukim v'amishpatim, these are the laws and the statutes asher tishmerun la'asos, that you should guard to do ba'aretz, in the land that God is giving you, to inherit all the days that you are living on the land. So, says the brisa as follows. It breaks down the pasuk. Ela hachukim, these are the laws. Ela midrashos. Chukim here refers to drashos, things that we learn out. They're not explicit in the verse. We learn them out through exegesis, through darshaning, and we learn out laws. That's what chukim refers to. V'amishpatim, and the statutes. What's the elu hadinim? These are the laws which are explicit. Asher tishmerun, that you should guard. What is that referred to? Zu mishnah, that's learning. You learn how to keep the mitzvahs. La'asos, to do. Zu ma'isa, that's the actual doing of them. Ba'aretz, now it says in the land. Yachol kol mitzvos kulan lo yunohagim ala ba'aretz. You might think from that it says to do it in the land, that all the mitzvahs only apply in the land of Israel. Talmud Lomar, that's why the Torah goes on in the same verse, and it says, Kol hayamim asher atem chayim al adama, all the days that you're living on the land, on earth. So it's all your days. That implies all the days, not just when you're in the land of Israel. Ikol hayamim, so if it's all the days, yachol yehunagim bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz, I might think that all the mitzvahs apply in the land and outside the land. All the days, they all apply everywhere. Talmud Lomar ba'aretz. That's why it said in the land. So it says in the land, some apply only in the land. It says kol hayom, some apply all the days everywhere you are. So acher shariba hakasuv umiyet, now that it has included everywhere, but it's also excluded and said only in the land. So how do we know how to apply it? When is the mitzvah in the land? When is it even outside the land? So so go and learn from what it says over there. Look at the next verse. What's the next verse there? You shall surely destroy all the places that the non-Jews have served idolatry, destroy all of their idols, etc. Now, is that related to the land itself? It's not. The mitzvah to destroy idolatry has nothing to do with the land. It's not an agricultural mitzvah. So ma avodas kochav miyuchadas sheichovas haguf. Just like avodah zara, the mitzvah of destroying avodah zara, of destroying idols, is a chovas haguf. It's an obligation on the person. It's an act. It's not in the land. V'no heges bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz, and that applies both in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel, because you look in the verse. That's what it says. It says all the days, and then which means everywhere, and then he says, Abei Tabadum, you should destroy the idolatry. It sounds like the mitzvah to destroy idolatry is all the days, applies everywhere. So, Af Kol Shechovas Haguf Noheges Bein Ba'aretz Bein B'chutz La'aretz. So therefore, all these types of mitzvos, all the Chovas Haguf, all the mitzvahs that are on a person's body apply both in Israel and outside of Israel. And so then what did it mean when it said Ba'aretz, that there are some that only apply in Israel? So those must be the other category. The ones that are not Chovas Haguf, the ones that are not an obligation on the body, on the person to perform, but they're an obligation on the land itself. So how we relate to the land, but they're mitzvahs that emanate from the land. So those commandments are specific, those are Ba'aretz. Those apply in the land of Israel and not outside the land of Israel. We'll hold there, pick up from here next time.